This is Debt Free in 30, where every week we take 30 minutes and get practical advice from industry experts about personal finance and living debt-free. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Yesterday, I was sitting in my office and I got an email. It was from Robert Brown, the author of Wealthing Like Rabbits, an original introduction to personal finance. Very good book. He's been on the podcast many times. And he said, I'm on my way through town tomorrow. I've got a big meeting in London, and Robert lives in Ajax, so he needed a stopping off point. He said, why don't I come to Kitchener and why don't you buy me breakfast? And I said, sure, I'd be happy to buy you breakfast, but here's the fee. You've got to come on the podcast. And he said, I'm happy to come on the podcast. Can I promote my book? I said, yes, you can promote your book. I understand how authors work. I promote my book wherever I go too. And he said, well, what are we going to talk about? And I said, well, back on August the 10th, there was a news story, and the story was that Charlie Sheen is having a dire financial crisis, and he has less than $10 million to his name. And you tweeted it out, and your tweet was, have fun, Twitter, you're welcome, sort of throwing it out there. So I thought, hey, that would be a good thing to talk about. So Robert Brown is here. Robert, how are you doing today?
Well, first of all, Doug, I'm doing great. And thank you for having me on the podcast again. I think this is my 5th or 6th appearance. And it's nice to be on the podcast when we're actually having a morning coffee. Because I think the last time we got together, we pounded back about 6 or 8 butter tarts.
That's correct. Podcast. The last podcast we were on was the number 2 butter tarts podcast. With Gail Vaz-Oxlade and Carrie Taylor were on that one as well. So today it's earlier in the morning. If we get through this, we'll actually have time for breakfast. So we'll try to move quickly on it. So
Charlie Sheen,
are you having a personal financial crisis? That's the title for this episode. So the article that you shared, which was all over the media back in the middle of August, was that I guess he was applying to reduce his child support or something, and his argument was, I've only got $10 million left. I'm basically destitute, the poor guy.
And for the average Canadian, obviously that's a ridiculous concept to have $10 million and be suffering a personal financial crisis. And it reminded me of every once in a while, every weekend, in fact, the Globe and Mail runs a personal finance profile of a couple or a person, and they take a look at their finances and they give them advice. And every once in a while, not often, they present something that to the average Canadian seems ridiculous. And there was one, Ilsa, and I can't forget the last name, a couple of years ago, where they were dentists and their combined incomes were close to $1 million a year, and they had all these assets, and they were in deep financial trouble. And they just got raked over Twitter for getting themselves in that situation, and the Globe and Mail took a little bit of heat for considering that a couple that deserved profile. And this reminded me of that, so I sent it out on Twitter to see if I could get some dialogue going. And I have to say I was a little disappointed because not very many people picked up on it. I thought we'd have some fun, but it did bring up that subject of personal financial crisis, which is something I think we're going to talk about today.
Well, and let's talk about it now then. So how much debt is too much? I guess is the kind of the starting point. So because a personal financial crisis, I guess you can define it a couple of ways. One is I don't have enough money to meet my bills every month.
Sure.
And yes, I totally agree. And I know with my clients, income is a big issue.
Yeah.
They don't have the same level of income that the median in the population is. And as a result, they have to use credit to survive. And as a result, you end up with a lot of debt. Yeah. Well, how much is too much debt?
Sure. And that's a great question. Obviously, you're right. There's 2 pieces to that equation. There's the debt piece and there's the income piece. And if somebody can't meet their debt commitments or pay their bills on their income they have, I would suggest that's a personal financial crisis. But I would also suggest that there's a lot of people out there who are paying their bills, barely paying their bills. And while that may not be crisis yet, are they saving any money? How long will it be before they're completely debt free? I don't know whether we're going to define that as a personal finance crisis, but I think it has an impending personal finance crisis. They're too close to the edge.
So that's an interesting concept. So I would, obviously, my answer would be the same to the first part. That, well, if you can't meet your obligations as they come due, then you've got a problem. You've got a serious personal financial crisis. You're taking it one step further and saying, well, maybe you're actually able to cover all your bills every month. And I know I see that with my clients quite frequently. Yeah, I'm covering all my bills because I'm taking a cash advance on the line of credit to make the payment on the credit card.
Sure.
And then I take a cash advance on the credit card next month to pay the other
So
one.
if you're kiting your debt from one form of debt to another, are you really paying off your bills, or are you just somehow managing to stay above water? I would suggest, and it's actually in my notes here, Doug, that if somebody's paying off their debt with additional debt because they have no other option, they're already in personal financial crisis, whether or not they're behind.
And clearly, kiting is the word that we accountants use, and that's where you're taking, borrowing from one to pay the other, and obviously that's a serious problem that you have to address. There has to be a way to address it. You took it a step further though and said, "But am I actually saving as well?"
Yeah, we get into all kinds of guidelines in personal finance. And at some point in this conversation, we're going to bring up housing and how much people are spending on houses. And the traditional rule of thumb would suggest that when you buy a house, you should be able to make your mortgage payments and pay your heating bills and all the stuff that comes with a housing expense monthly on 30 to 35% of your household's annual gross income. That's a benchmark that's been around forever. And I think that's a good benchmark. And the other benchmark for buying a new house is that, you shouldn't really buy a house that the price exceeds any more than 3 times that annual income. So in that sense, if you make $150,000 a year, you're looking at a $450,000 house as a guideline, as a benchmark. Well, I think we all know, certainly in Toronto and in the GTA, there's a lot of people buying houses that are a lot more expensive than that because houses are expensive without that level of income. So now they got 40, 50, 60% of their income driven toward just covering their housing expenses. And that's gross. That's before paying taxes. That's before buying groceries. That's before buying their car. That's before putting gas in their car. And it's certainly before saving. And almost always the first thing to get pushed out is saving, which is going to set you up for that personal finance crisis further down the road.
Yeah, and it doesn't hit you today. I'm able to kind of keep things afloat, but if I'm never putting anything aside, then I end up retiring and there's nothing there. Right. So the train is coming down the track. So I guess if we were to make a list of how do I know if I'm either in a personal financial crisis or are about to have one, the most obvious one is I'm not meeting my debts as they come due. I'm not being able to pay my bills. I'm having to borrow every month. I think the second one would be, is my debt level increasing every month?
Yeah.
And again, I have lots of clients who say, no, I'm keeping up now, but I'm afraid of what could happen in the future. Well, you're not really keeping up now because you're borrowing from Peter, robbing from Peter to pay Paul. So the way to find out if you're doing that is to take a look, add up all what your credit card balances were last month and your line of credit and everything else, add them up again this month. If that number has gone up, you're not keeping up.
We need to take a look at the time frame too, because a lot of people, they address their debt by stretching their debt out over a longer period of time, which inevitably means you're going to be paying more on that debt. So you might be able to reduce your monthly payment a little bit if you do it right. And I'm using the quotation marks when I say right. But if you've extended that debt for another 5 or 10 years, you've extended the problem, and overall it's arguably worse.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, compound interest works both ways.
Yes, it does. It's either working for you or it's working against you. And I'm one of those guys that's always going on about how powerful compound interest is when you're saving. But it's important to realize that if you're paying interest, be that on a mortgage, typically considered good debt, although I would argue that in some cases.
Yes.
But if you're paying it, it's not working for you.
And in your book, Wealthing Like Rabbits, did you actually mention compound interest at all? Did that come up at all?
And I went on about it quite a bit, the whole compound interest piece. And in both sides of the equation, how powerful it can be when it's working in your favor and how important it is to start saving early because you take advantage of that longer time period. But just as I was alluding to in the debt earlier, if you stretch your debt out over a longer period of time, compound interest is working against you, and it's extraordinary how much more money you can end up paying. And the best example is probably a mortgage. Even if you buy a house that is reasonable for your income, and even if you buy a house that, you plan to pay it off in the traditional 20 to 25 years, taking as little as 2 or 3 years off that total amortization can save you tens of thousands of dollars. And if you're aggressive and take 7 or 8 years off and pay off a 25-year mortgage in 17 years off the top of my head, you can save $70,000, $80,000 depending upon the interest rate and how much you put down and all the other variables. But it's shocking how much money you can save. Big numbers.
And when you do that same math with things like credit cards, it's much more massive because your credit card interest is much higher. So, okay, so we've gone through some of the warning signs that you're in a financial crisis. What do you think it is that brings on a financial crisis? I mean, obviously there are some things that are within your control, some things that are not within your control. What do you think brings on a financial crisis?
Well, let's talk about some of the things that are outside your control, and then we'll get into some of the things that are inside, because that'll spin into what you can do to avoid it a little bit. But people sometimes lose their income because of health reasons, because of the employment market. They lose their job, they get laid off. Things happen in the world, and really few things will throw as big a wrench into someone's personal finances, especially if they're already stretched the edge, as losing a job or having a substantial loss of income. It just becomes virtually impossible to manage the debt after that.
Yeah, and I know with my clients who've got into so much trouble that they had to file a bankruptcy or consumer proposal, in virtually all cases, there have been one or more external shocks. And you went through the list. I mean, health problems. And you think, oh, well, in Canada, healthcare is free. Yeah, but if you're not working for a year because of an injury, because of an illness, you don't have the income coming in. You're still paying a whole bunch of expenses yourself. So
or if that illness causes you not to be able to do the job that you were in before and you have to go seek a new job, which may not pay as much.
Yep. It becomes
all kinds of issues there.
It becomes pretty serious. So and then obviously job loss, marriage breakup, these are all significant things. So those are outside of your control. I mean, I guess we can have the debate about, well, if I got injured at work, maybe I wasn't careful enough. But let's just assume that those are items that are outside of your control. And I think it's very important to identify those items, because a lot of people come in to see me and they're down. Yeah. It's like, oh man, I'm in this mess, and I really feel bad that I'm in this situation.
But at least they're in to see you.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And at least it's like going to the doctor. Okay, I'm not happy to be here. It's like going to the dentist. I'm not happy that I got a sore mouth, but
hopefully 2 weeks from now.
Exactly. Yeah. Hopefully it'll you'll be able to fix it. So I say to them, look, stuff happens.
Yep.
And so there's no sense beating yourself up.
Do you say stuff, Doug?
No. I mean, this is a family podcast, and we're actually recording this on video today too, if the video machines are all working. So this will be on YouTube as well. So we have to keep it clean here. So I say stuff happens.
Yeah.
And if it's outside of your control, you don't have to beat yourself up about it. It happened. You're driving down the highway, you get rear-ended. Nothing you could have done to mitigate against that. It just happened. So you know what? You call your insurance, you get your car fixed, you move on.
Even if it's something that was within your control, there's no value in beating yourself up over it. Learn from it. Mm-hmm. Don't make that mistake again. Recognize it, but address the problem and move on.
Because once it's done, it's done.
Once it's done, it's done.
It's as simple as that. So, okay, so let's go to the next step then, which is, what is in your control, and therefore, how can you be prepared? What can you do to avoid potential crises in the future?
Well, Doug, you and I have talked a number of times, and the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth is to live within your means or live a little bit below your means. One of the best things you can do to avoid a personal finance crisis is not to live on the edge. I talked about housing, and listen, I understand completely. This is one of those things that's easier said than done in today's marketplace, but try to keep your housing costs under control and don't feel the need to buy the big $3,200 mansion. Few things are as big a drain on a person's finances as housing. And I'm not just talking about the mortgage, it's huge, but we're talking about heating, we're talking about renovation, we're talking about insurance, we're talking about taxes, we're talking about, the financial crises that can come with a house. The furnace breaks down, you need a new roof, and a wasp's nest gets inside your roof and you need to have that replaced. Houses cost a ton of money. And anything that you can do to reasonably keep your housing costs under control will be a huge benefit as you try to get your overall finances in line.
Because that's your biggest expense, probably.
Yeah, that is almost everybody's big expense. And the second biggest expense in the same vein is your car. I'm a firm believer in cars need to be safe. They need to be reliable. They need to get you comfortably and safely from point A to point B. You do not need a $70,000 BMW to make that happen. I drove here today in my 2008 Honda Accord with 283,000 kilometers on it, and it worked just fine.
Honda Accord. Well, as a matter of fact, I drive the same car. I'm a little more advanced than you. I have a 2011.
Wow.
I've only got 184,000 on it. And I know that number for a fact because for the last week, the battery hasn't worked. And so I've had to carry with me that charging brick to, boot it up every time. So I finally got it into, and the place said, yeah, your battery's shot. I mean, you got like a 7-year-old car. Look how corroded it is. So I had to replace the battery.
Yeah,
but
so that battery that you had to replace likely cost you 1/3 of what a monthly payment on a new car would be.
Oh yeah,
inconvenient for sure. There are some inconveniences that come with driving older used cars, and there's a point of no return for sure. But overall, big picture is drive a car that makes sense.
Yep, and I know where all the controls are in my car, and when it stops working, I will get another one. But I bought this one new. Yeah. I've had it for 7 years, and hopefully I can get another 100,000 on it, and then we'll flip it. But who knows? Maybe tomorrow it'll be different. So okay, so how to be prepared and avoid a crisis? I guess what you're saying is start with the basics. Figure out what it costs you to live every month. Start with the biggest number. Is there anything you can do about that? So housing costs is the biggest one. And you're absolutely right. I mean, we're recording this in the, late summer, early fall of 2018. The housing market is still pretty robust in Ontario. Although
I know two people that predicted it would decline about a year
absolutely
and a half
right.
ago.
And I
were right, it did decline.
It did. I will put a link in the show notes because we recorded the first, what we call Butter Tarts podcast. And I know we recorded it on May the 1st, 2017 in my office in Toronto. And we're recording this in the Debt Free and 30 studios here in Kitchener today. But we recorded that in Toronto, and we both said that, we think we're at the peak. And I think we called it pretty much within the day because that's when Home Capital was imploding and a whole bunch of other things were happening. And the market certainly has faded since then. Now, that doesn't mean that, we released this podcast, the housing market doesn't bounce back up and every house is $4 million. But if you can keep your housing costs down, then you're saving a ton of money.
Absolutely.
It's as simple as that. And if you can have as inexpensive a transportation as you can within reason, again, you're saving a ton of money. And that extra cash flow obviously can be used to reduce debt, pay savings, whatever.
Again, every situation is different, and I know this doesn't apply to everything, but one of the few things that people who live in Toronto can do to offset the ridiculous cost of housing in that city is to avoid a car and use public transportation. And listen, I know you're going to hear a lot of noise about the TTC and how horrible it is, and I get that 100%, but it is a less expensive option than driving in that city.
Yeah, and I guess that's where you have to take into account, where do I work and where can I live? So if you work downtown but live in the suburbs, Ajax, Barrie, something like that, then, maybe you have no choice but to take public transit because it takes 2 hours to drive into the city.
Well, listen, I'd rather take the GO train into the city than drive any day of the year.
But the flip side is you've got, longer transportation costs or time, and time is actually a real thing. Yeah. You can't discount that. So I think you're right. You got to look at the big picture. We're not here to tell you what you should do.
But we're here to suggest that you look at the big picture and do the analysis and not just throw money at an issue because that can get you into trouble later down the road.
So what are your tips then for handling the stress of a crisis when it actually happens? So I'm now in a situation where I've got a lot of debt, my expenses are too high, I'm starting to freak out. I think we already gave one tip, and that is don't focus on the past. So whatever happened. There's no sense beating yourself up over what happened. It's done.
And face the issue. Don't try to avoid it. Don't look for ways to pick up more debt and just postpone it. And that's tough for some people to face that realization that things are starting to spiral out of control. But face the issue, start to make some notes. And then I guess the second step is to be really disciplined and get out a pencil, get out a paper, get out a calculator, get out a spreadsheet, and really start to clearly and objectively take a look at your debt, take a look at your income, and get a full and complete understanding of where you are. Whether or not it's to prevent a financial crisis or to help solve one, few things in the world of personal finance are as eye-opening as actually tracking all your expenses, taking a look at where all of your money goes. And that's a little bit of a nerdy, painful thing to do, but almost without exception, anybody who takes a close look at where every dollar of their income goes over a 3-month period of time is shocked, and their eyes are open to see where their money actually goes. Very few people are really aware of that.
So you're suggesting two things, and to put it in accountant language, you're suggesting preparing a balance sheet and an income statement.
Sure.
So a balance sheet, yeah, that's what I'm suggesting. Yeah, sure. So a balance sheet is on one side, here's what I own. On the other side, here's what I owe.
Yes.
And so if you're in a severe financial crisis, there's probably not a whole lot of stuff on the left-hand side. Maybe you own a house, maybe you own a car, maybe there's not a whole lot there. The right-hand side is all the debts that I have. And unless you actually write them down or put them on a spreadsheet or document it somehow, it's amazing how many people don't know what they actually owe. And I see it literally every day when people come in to see me.
I do a lot of speaking at colleges and universities on the subject of personal finance, and I rant off pretty good about credit cards and how to use them properly. And I almost always ask the students how many of them have received their credit card bill or their credit card statement at the end of the month, opened up the envelope or clicked online and said, holy stuff. I can't believe I spent that much money. I forgot I went out for dinner there. I forgot I went to Amazon on this. I have no idea. And what do? Hopefully they pay it off in full. And they do the same thing the next month. And they say, holy stuff, every month. And at some point, you have to make a realization that when you use credit, it's not as painful. And I use that word metaphorically as it is when you pay with cash and you're spending money you don't yet have, and it's easier to do it. Almost every student I talk to about this says, yeah, absolutely. I've opened up my credit card statement and said, I have no idea where that money went. So take a look at that statement and say, did I need to do that? Did I need to spend that money? Did I need to spend that money? And on top of that, why did I need to do it with my credit card? Would have I been more aware if I had paid with cash? And you start to build that awareness. One of the tips that I always give to students is never, ever pay your credit card every month. And everybody says, oh, I thought you just said for like 10 minutes, you got to pay your bill every month. I did, but I think you should pay your credit card bill every week. Students are all online. So go online, see your credit card statement every week and pay it then. Number one, if you can't do it, you probably shouldn't have used the credit card in the first place. But almost more importantly, Doug, it just builds so much awareness of where their money's going if you do it in a more timely basis. And just like someone who's trying to lose weight starts to count their calories, almost intuitively starts to become more aware of it, people who look at their spending on a regular basis and really look at it will start to spend less money.
Yeah, a credit card has to be a substitute for cash, not a way to borrow.
Excellent.
So if you have $100 sitting in your bank account and you're going to the store and you don't want to carry $100 cash with you, fine, use your credit card. But you're right, there's no reason you can't go home and transfer the money from your bank account to the credit card right then and there. And okay, you're probably not going to do it every day, but I like your idea. Do it every week.
Yeah.
And then the balance is always cleared up. At absolute minimum, you have to do it every month or else you get whacked with a bunch of service charges, and that's just ridiculous.
Here's another one. Why do most people, I'm not talking about people who run their businesses on their credit card, why do most personal people need to carry around a credit card with a $20,000 line of credit? Why? You know, if someone is carrying around a credit card and they have a balance of, a limit of, let's say, $1,000, I think we would both agree that with the $1,000 limit, it's pretty hard to get into serious trouble.
Yeah,
okay?
Well, you can only get into $1,000 worth of trouble.
Right. You know, so but people saying, hey, I got a credit card. It's got a $20,000 limit. Well, that's great.
Well, and you hit the nail on the head. The reason we want as high a limit as possible is it makes us feel good, right? They call them credit cards because credit is a positive thing, you know, give credit where credit is due. And so I figure I'm a better person if I have a $20,000 limit than if I have a $10,000 limit. So, and of course, the credit card companies will increase your limit if everything is going great. And then, of course, they'll shrink it when things aren't. So you want to be kind of conscious of that. I think the planning point there is figure out how much credit you need. What do you use in a month? And okay, maybe I'm going on vacation. I'm going to have to buy some plane tickets or something. Okay, so the maximum I would ever need to spend in a month before I could pay the credit card off is $5,000. Well, okay, then I guess you need a $5,000 limit. Can't get into any more trouble than that.
Or, you know, carry a smaller limit for most of the time. And then if you have a large expense coming up, you've saved the money and you're going to Europe and you want to book that flight with your credit card, call the credit card company and say, hey, listen, I'm going to book a flight. I've got the money. Increase my limit to $5,000 for the next month. Do your trip to Europe and then call them back when you get back and say, listen, I want to bring that down to $1,000. And that's, people have to look themselves in the mirror and ask themselves if that's right for them. If someone has a $20,000 limit and they never go over the $1,000, well, it's a silly idea. But if you're one of those people that is constantly spending more money on your credit card than you would like to, one of the tools you can use is to pull down your limit.
Yep. And in other words, make it hard to use that credit card. I mean, another thing people say as well, take your credit cards, put them in some water and put them in the freezer.
Yeah.
Well, you can't use them instantly then. There won't be any impulse shopping when you do that. So
you know what? You can leave your house without your credit card in the wallet. You can.
I've never heard of that.
You can do that.
Well, not when you drive old Honda Accords like we do. They might break down. You might have to have the credit card there. So again, looking at the planning points then, so I'm putting words in your mouth, but what you said is, okay, you need to create a balance sheet. You need to create an income statement. So here's everything I own. Here's everything I owe. And when you actually write it down, you go, oh, because this happens all the time. I have people come in and they say, yeah, I think my total debts are about, $20,000, $30,000. And I say, great, let's add it all up. And we add it all up and it's $50,000. They go, wow, I forgot about that. And I didn't really consider my line of credit to be a debt. I consider that just my line of credit, but you're right. You add that all in, it's a bigger number. So once you know what you owe, and I like to sort them by highest interest rate to lowest interest rate, because then it's like, wow, I better be chipping away at the bigger ones first. But then the second component, which is what you're talking about, is the budget. Here's what goes in and here's what goes out every month. Right. And if I'm spending a lot of money on things that I don't think I'm getting great value for, well, maybe I should only eat out once a week instead of 6 times a week. I can find ways to shrink it down. So that's how to begin to mitigate when you find yourself in a financial crisis. Are there any other pieces of advice you've got on that, or anything else? Any other ways to recover from a financial crisis when you've discovered that you're in one?
Well, depending upon how bad you think your financial crisis is, obviously, if you think that the situation is beyond what you can manage yourself, you need to walk down the street and see Doug Hoyes at one of his offices and have the conversation, because a licensed insolvency trustee can give you some good counsel on what your options are. And I'm going to let you speak to this a little bit, but I think a lot of people always assume that if they're in that much trouble, they're going to have to declare bankruptcy, which has a horrible connotation in today's society. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what some of the options are.
I appreciate the plug. You're absolutely right. The vast majority of people who come to see us don't end up filing bankruptcy. The vast majority end up not having to actually file with us. We end up having them talk to a mortgage broker, or they get their tax filed, or they work out a budget and are able to get back on track themselves. So you're right. Licensed insolvency trustee means we're licensed by the federal government, and there are a whole bunch of rules I have to follow. And one of them is I cannot charge you any money up front. So by law, I cannot charge an upfront fee. So if you come to see us, there is no charge for that. It's only when you actually start whatever process it is that we can start charging you money. So it doesn't cost anything to talk to us. And if you have more debt than you can handle, then we will explain the options. And the most common option that we deal with now is a consumer proposal, where we actually make a deal with the people you owe money to. So my typical person we would help would have sort of $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 worth of debts to credit cards, bank loans, income taxes, which we can include, payday loans, that sort of thing. And we work out a deal where you pay a chunk of it back, but generally nowhere near the full amount. It might be a third, it might be a half. There's no more interest. So it gives you the breathing room. That's a great solution for someone who has an income, has money coming in, but just not enough to deal with the vast amount of debt. So you don't have to go bankrupt. We make a deal. You end up making the payments to it. The debts are wiped out and you're back on track. And again, I come back to the earlier point we made that you don't have to beat yourself up about it. Stuff happens. You get a cavity, you go to a dentist, you get it filled, you move on. You don't wait till all your teeth fall out.
Break your toe, you go to a hospital, you get a cast, you move on. Maybe a little slower, but you move on.
Yep. Yeah, that's right. There's maybe a period of rehabilitation, but you get back on track. So, well, I think that's excellent. Are there any other points that you want to make on financial crisis? Do you have any other advice for Charlie Sheen? Like what would you like to tell us here?
This is a family rated podcast, so I'll skip the Charlie Sheen advice. The only other thing I was thinking is that, in the avoidance of the personal finance crises, I think people need to more constantly take a look at their income opportunities. And you and I come from a generation where a lot of people got jobs when they, got out of college or got out of university, and they stayed with the company for a long period of time. And I find that younger people today are less likely to do that. And part of that's out of necessity because income wages are so low. And they're always looking for side hustles and ways to make more money, and always looking for ways to advance themselves. And I think that's a good thing to do. Always be asking yourself, is this the right, is my income right for me now? Is there an opportunity for me to be happier and make more money? Is there something I could do on the side with my hobby to bring in more money? And obviously that leads into a higher income, which will allow you to set some money aside for an emergency fund in case something pops up. And do what you can to get more money when you can.
I think that's an excellent point. We focus on cutting expenses, which is the easiest thing. Well, not the easiest, but it's the quickest bang for your buck. But it's not easy to do quickly. I mean, if I'm renting an apartment and I've got a 1-year lease, I can't just rent another apartment tomorrow unless I find someone else to take it over. So whereas looking for other income opportunities, well, sure, part-time job, side hustle, whatever. Yeah. It's math, right? It's what comes in, what goes out. If you can make one higher, then
and if you can do both, lower those expenses and raise the income, then it becomes easier to manage and it becomes easier to get out of trouble.
Then it's fantastic. So the book is Wealthing Like Rabbits, an original introduction to personal finance. And give us and you've been on the show before, and I'll put links to, the full description of what we've talked about in the book, but give us kind of the 30-second overview of what kind of book is it? Is it a book? And I know the answer to this. I'm setting you up here because I read the book. Yeah. Is it a book of spreadsheets, Robert? Is that what it's about?
No, Doug, it is not a book of spreadsheets. I think it's fair to say the book is aimed at younger people in their 20s and 30s, relatively just getting started out. But in the same breath, I think it contains good advice for people of all ages. And what I tried to do is write a personal finance book that didn't contain a lot of charts and spreadsheets. Instead, it has a lot of humor and anecdotes and pop culture references, trying to take a subject that, let's face it, can be pretty boring sometimes, personal finance, and make it more accessible.
Yeah, and I have read the book, and it's more like a story than a textbook. Well, way more. It's, certainly easy to understand. You're right. It's not like it's a whole bunch of complicated math. So where can people get the book? Bookstores everywhere?
Yeah, they can pick it up at Chapters Indigo across the country. They can find it at my website at wealthinglike-rabbits.com. Ebook is available at Kobo. Pretty much everywhere a book is available, you'll find it.
Kindle? Is there a Kindle book too?
There is a Kindle book
too. There you go.
Yeah.
So, and what Robert and I like to do is we go to bookstores, and if we see both of our books on the shelf, we always move them to the front. So if you're at a bookstore and you see, by strange coincidence, Wealthing Like Rabbits and
beside Straight Talking Your Money, one of us has been there.
That's right, and we've done that. Sorry, Chapters. That's just what's the way we roll. That's how we roll, man. That's how we do it. So excellent. And where can people find you on Twitter?
They can find me on Twitter at Wealthing Rabbits. And my Twitter feed is a mix of personal finance advice, some silly banality, and just some general conversation. I'm all over the page there.
Excellent. I will put links to that in the show notes as well, at Wealthing Rabbit. There's no S on it, I don't think.
There's not.
No, at Wealthing Rabbit. And you could also search for Robert R. Brown, but there's more Robert Browns on Twitter than there are Wealthing Rabbit people. So it's an excellent Twitter feed to follow as well. Robert, thanks very much for being here.
Doug, always a pleasure. Have me back anytime.
Thank you very much. So that was Robert Brown, author of Wealthing Like Rabbits. We were talking about, are you having a financial crisis? So hopefully we gave you some practical advice there. I will put a full transcript of today's show with the show notes over at hoyes.com. That's HOYES.com. And as I said, we've also video recorded this, so I will put a link to the YouTube video, assuming it all worked.
I would think your first video podcast would feature two people more attractive.
Well, I would think so. We'll have to work on that in the future. But yes, we're setting up the Debt Free in 30 studio here in Kitchener. So Robert was kind enough to be the guinea pig for the setup. So I appreciate that. So I will put all the links to that as well. And that was our discussion about, are you having a personal financial crisis? That was Debt Free in 30. My name is Doug Hoyes. Thanks for watching and listening.